This morning I want to tell the boys and girls a story that centers around the activities and travels of Elder and Mrs. James White. Back in the 1850s, Elder and Mrs. James White had spent some time in northwestern Illinois. And this was the time that the group of believers had settled over in Waukegan, Iowa, and were starting the work and the movement there. A couple of the individuals that had moved over there were the Loughborough family, who became very prominent in Adventist history following that, and J.N. Andrews, John Andrews, whom Andrews University is named after today. There had been some problems there. Elder and Mrs. White were anxious to go and visit with them and work with them and see if the church there could move forward and do great things for God. It was in December, and it gets very cold in that part of the world, and they have snowstorms and ice storms. And between Illinois and Iowa lay what river? The Mississippi River. And how many of you have crossed the Mississippi River? Almost everybody. How about you boys and girls? You know, they call it the mighty Mississippi. It's a big river. Well, Elder and Mrs. White had been staying with a family by the name of Hart. And they had talked about this trip for some days. Finally, they decided that it was time to go. There had been a lot of rain. It had been thawing, but it came a snowstorm and turned cold. And so one afternoon about 5 o'clock, they left with a team and a sleigh. They'd put a wagon box on the sleigh, a box about 12 feet long and 3 feet wide with sides on it, and they had seats there. They started out. A little different than we travel today. They traveled that afternoon and way into the evening, and they arrived at a little town there that's no longer in existence in northwestern Illinois. They spent the night, and during the night a snowstorm came up. And it snowed several inches that night. In fact, about 2 feet, which is about 24 inches. And the wind blew, and there were great drifts. And they had to stay in that town a week before they could travel on. But a week later, they got started again. And as they came near the Mississippi River, they met a number of individuals traveling by horseback and afoot. And they said, "Can we cross the river?" Because after the snowstorm, it had started to rain, and it had warmed up again. And they were planning on crossing the river on the ice that was there, freezing hard and thick enough that it would carry a team of horses, a sleigh, and them across. The people said it's dangerous. There's a lot of water on the river. We wouldn't advise it. I'd never try it. They got all kinds of answers, but none of them that were positive. They arrived at a little village right on the banks of the Mississippi River that evening and spent the night. It didn't get very cold during that night, and the next morning they drove on out to the river a couple, 3 miles. And Brother Hart was driving his team, and he looked across the river, and there was about a foot of water on top of the ice. And he said to Elder and Mrs. White, "Is it Illinois or is it Iowa?" And Mrs. White said, "Iowa." Elder White said, "Let's move across." And with a prayer on their hearts, they drove the team down onto the ice and started across the river. You know, a team of horses walking in water that's about a foot deep make a lot of noise, and the water swirled, and they started moving across. There were people on the other side of the river that saw the team coming across, and they gathered there on the banks wondering what in the world they meant by starting across. There had been some other teams that had broken through the ice. Some of the drivers of those teams had nearly lost their life in saving their animals. But Brother Hart drove his team across. And as they neared the other shore, a shout of joy went up from the people standing on the bank. "The Lord has been with you, because the ice will not hold a team of horses and a sleigh. The Lord has been with you." Elder and Mrs. White says of that experience that, you know, God can cement a river the same as he can open the Red Sea. You know, boys and girls, as we think back on that experience, and then as we think of what transpired when Elder and Mrs. White got over into Iowa and met with the believers and the church there, it was at that meeting that Loughborough and Andrews decided that they would go back into full-time ministry. It was shortly after that that John Andrews was the first missionary that went to Europe. And John Loughborough was one of the greatest and mightiest preachers this church has ever known. God needed the help that the Whites gave when they crossed the river, the day when everyone else said they couldn't. And let me tell you, boys and girls, we serve a God that when we're on His business and we are His child, that can not only open the Red Sea, but He can cause the ice of the mighty Mississippi to be further if we are on His side.